Hi friends, my name is Victoria Bowler, and today we get to finish up planning our entire year of elementary music. In the last two videos, we've looked at what we are teaching, we've looked at when we are going to teach it, and we've looked at what materials we are going to use. So we have everything we need except for the activities themselves. So where do we get these activities? One option is that we could get them from someone else, like in a workshop or a video or Instagram or a book or something like that. And that is a fabulous option. It can save us a lot of time to get ideas from someone else if we know what we are looking for. When we know the exact type of activity that we want and where it fits into our curriculum as a whole, it makes the search for activities from another resource, it makes that search much more streamlined. The framework that we're talking about today is what is going to save us from hours of looking for ideas in books or YouTube or TikTok or whatever else and getting bogged down in that search. Because what can happen in that situation sometimes is that we are hoping to find something interesting to do next week. And then we end up spending, 3 hours scrolling ideas. And at the end of it, we still don't have anything. When we have a progression for learning, we don't have to spend time searching for random fun activities to fill class. Each activity is purposeful, and certainly it's going to be fun, but we're choosing it for an intentional reason, and it comes from the activities that we did before, and it's going to build toward the activities that we do in our next class. So when we plan this way with a concept plan, with a progression of learning activities, lesson planning kind of takes care of itself because we always know what is coming next. And of course, if you do decide to make some or all of your own activities, this process definitely streamlines that as well. So here we go. Let's talk about concept plans. We can use a concept plan to walk through the entire learning process of a musical element. Musical element here meaning a discipline-specific concept like mi, re, do, or toccadini. This concept plan is going to help us organize how we are going to teach and what we are going to teach. So when we use a concept plan, every activity, like we were talking about, every activity is grounded and it's tied to a specific curricular objective. Now, a very quick word on terminology here. I gravitate toward the term concept plan instead of unit plan, and that's a total potato thing. But when I think of units, I'm imagining like isolated segments of instruction, like a unit on barred instruments or a unit on music theory. And for our purposes here in this conversation, I'm interested in thinking a little bit more big picture about how musical understandings and skills can connect and build over time. So integrated instead of isolated. Again, potato. So let's look at the components of a concept plan, or some possible components of a concept plan. First, like we talked about, a discipline-specific concept. This is the target rhythmic or melodic element that we're going to be working with in these learning activities. And we might have other musical focuses as well, not just rhythm or melody. We might want to add in some part work skills or emphasize form or something like that. So when we choose this discipline-specific concept, we are going to choose it based on that curriculum outline and the scope and sequence that we talked about in previous videos. So let's imagine, just for this example, that we're going to create a learning progression to teach 4 sounds on one beat, what we notate in this classroom as toccadini. Okay, so we have our musical focus. Now let's look at a concept in a little more broad sense of the word. This is going back to that values section that we talked about in the first video. So let's bring those values back around here. This is a video, I'll link it here, that explains more of how to plan with these macro concepts like creativity or self-awareness or something like that. So I'll recommend that video if you're interested in hearing more. Many of our big picture values can be used or adapted slightly to be our macro concept for these concept plans. And these big picture values, these are like the lens that we will use to look at our activities. Or another way to think about it, like we talked about in that previous video, is that we're choosing the bowl that all of the other activities are going into, if we're thinking about the nested approach. So whatever that lens is, we're going to use it to look at the actual activities in the concept plan. And we'll look at those activities here in just a moment. But when we talk about those activities with the lens of, let's just use collaboration as an example. If we talk about those activities with the lens of collaboration, then let's imagine we're playing a passing game. We're going to point out how everyone in the group needs to collaborate in order to make this passing game move smoothly. Or if we are doing some partner work, we might practice collaborating with a lot of different people in the group. And we might practice collaboration skills like how to listen and how to give an idea. We might also practice how to find a partner, how to decline a partner if you don't want to work with that person, and things like that. So collaboration would be the lens that we use to look at all of those other activities. What do students need to know and have experience with before they walk into this concept plan? Again, we're going back to our musical sequence for this knowledge component. So in our example of Talkademi, if we want students to orally identify 4 sounds on one beat, and if we want them to have vocabulary to talk about what they hear as far as the differences between different sounds on a beat, then we're going to want to make sure that they have conscious musical knowledge of all of the material that came before these 4 sounds on one beat in our sequence of rhythmic concepts. And we can also think about what skills students need. So for example, if we're going to sing a song and add an ostinato on barred instruments, what types of musical skills are students going to need before they get to the barred instruments? Maybe we want them to have the skill of getting out and putting away the instruments. Or maybe we want them to have the skill and enough experience to know which is the high side and which is the low side of the instruments. Or maybe we want them to know how to bounce their mallets, things like that. All of these play a part in thinking through the skills that students are going to need for these activities, skills that they should have beforehand. There are also some competencies in other areas that students might need. So for example, if students are going to, like we were just talking about, if they're going to work with a partner in a barred instrument activity, they will need to they may need to have had some training in how to find a partner and how to take turns with them and how to stay on task, things like that. These are the social and emotional and logistical skills that students might need beforehand to make the activities successful. Now, something to say here, we can certainly teach some of these skills in the concept plan itself. Not everything has to be completely pre-taught, but we don't want to just throw an activity at students without thinking through all of the prerequisites that they might need inside their musical tool belts in order to be successful. It is really helpful to have this kind of information going into an activity. That way we can scaffold things appropriately and we're not taken by complete surprise if an activity flops. So thinking through previous knowledge and skills and competencies that students should have before they get to the activities in this concept plan. Assessments help us learn from our students. I love assessments. I love the assessment process because through this process, students teach us what we need to do next as the teacher. It's an opportunity for us to learn from students. So when students begin this concept plan, where do we expect them to be? And then at the end, where do we hope students are going to be at the end of this concept plan? The assessments here at the beginning and at the end of the concept plan, they help us kind of frame our thinking, our decisions about how we're going to maneuver through the activities. It's a way for us to get information from students. So in this sound before sight model, we want to make sure that the new musical element is in students' ears and in their bodies as much as possible. That's the very first step. And so very often, I want to make sure that students can sing this new musical material tunefully or that they can perform it in time if it's a rhythmic concept. And at the end of the process, very often, I hope that students will show me that they can use the material consciously in a creative decision, either improvisation or arranging or composition. And these do not have to be your pre-assessment and post-assessments. You can have something different that you value as long as it makes sense. If we think about where students will be at the very beginning of this learning interaction and where they will be at the end of this learning interaction, we can have different things that we focus on specifically for this post-assessment because we can value different things in our programs. So let's take this example with Takadimi. In the beginning of our process, I don't need them to have conscious knowledge. I don't need them to be able to use Takadimi consciously, but I do want to know that it's in their ears and their voices and in their bodies. So we have a performance pre-assessment just to make sure that we have it in our bodies. And then at the end, one option is that we could arrange rhythmic building blocks with Takadimi. So we're taking Takadimi and we put it into a different context with the rhythmic building blocks. Okay, repertoire. We talked about repertoire in the last video. We can look for repertoire here on this website or with any of those other resources that we talked about. So since we've already gone through that step of the process, very quickly, let's just hang out on this example. Let's imagine that we are going to look for songs to teach Takadimi. And of these songs or whatever resource you're using, maybe we decide to choose 4-ish. That's a big ish. It depends on the activities that we're going to build and how we are using these songs. But when in doubt, somewhere 3 to 5-ish songs is a good starting place. Okay, so now we have all of that preliminary stuff out of the way. That's all of the getting ready for the concept plan steps. So now let's talk about the fun part and actually break down this progression of learning so that we can create some activities. Again, no surprise here, these phases are based on a sound before sight model. Sound before sight is not the only way to teach music, and what we're talking about today, is definitely not the only sound before sight way to teach music. But it's the one that I use with my students personally. It's the one that I use in the curriculum that I write, and it's the one that I really like. And so maybe you might like it too. So I will share how I think about this. That way you can take this format and adapt it to another pedagogical system like Schulwerk or the Korai concept. And I'll give just a very quick caveat before we jump in. Let me say that I don't think that these two approaches are basically the same thing. I don't even think that teachers should necessarily blend different approaches together. I'm talking about the learning progression with this particular vocabulary so that we can talk in broad strokes about this application of sound before sight. Okay, we're going to start our learning with an active musical experience where we notice the musical characteristics and we explore them in a community with other musicians. So activities in this stage might be things like creative movement or improvisation or singing a song and playing a game. We might also move to the melodic contour or we could clap the rhythm of the words or put those words on body percussion. We could play the song on instruments or we could add an ostinato. We might arrange rhythmic building blocks with graphic notation. And then at some point, we're going to lead students to notice the new musical element and analyze it orally, and then describe how we could communicate it visually. Okay, already right here, a lot of stuff happening in this first phase of this learning progression. With all of these activities, we are going to focus very specifically on the new target musical sound, like in this case, 4 sounds on one beat, or it could also be tonic, it could also be a bitonic melody, whatever that new thing is that we are learning that we've pulled from the extractable phrases. You'll recall that we talked about that in the previous video. All of these activities are going to really highlight the new musical material in that extractable phrase or in those extractable phrases. Let's look at some examples here very quickly. So, for these examples, we might start out with things like speaking the rhyme and playing the game. We could introduce a song using body percussion. We could jump into some rhythm improvisation right away. Lots of examples here. And then eventually, we're going to narrow in some of these exploration activities to ask students about how many sounds they hear on each beat. This is noticing the new musical sound and finding a way to describe it. And then in something like this activity, we're going to find a way to show it visually. Here's an example of using this new element with graphic notation in rhythmic building blocks. Okay, so these are just a few activities that we could do out of the many, many, many activities in this active making music phase of learning. If you wear an Orff Schulwerk hat, depending on which model you're using, because there's not one single progression of the Orff Schulwerk approach. If you are using the model that starts with preliminary play, then this is preliminary play, imitation, and exploration. And you can see that in the progression of examples that we are looking at here. Those follow what these phases, what these activities might look like in an Orff context. And then in the Kodai concept, this is preparation. The active musical experience portion, this is what a lot of Kodai teachers might consider to be physical prep or early prep. And then as we keep going, these might be what Kodai teachers would consider to be oral and visual prep in middle and late preparation. Like we talked about in the Sound Before Sight video, this is where the real magic happens. Students do the bulk of this learning on their own here in this phase. So now let's communicate what we have found in the active musicking phase of learning. Real musicians communicate music in so many different ways, and real musicians talk about music differently. And sometimes they write it down differently from each other, and sometimes, guess what? They don't write it down at all. So because real musicians have so many different ways to communicate music, it's helpful to establish a vocabulary and a notation system that we're going to use with the musicians in this class. So in the Schulwerk, if you're following a model like Jane Frazie's, this is the label piece. And in the Kodai concept, this is the presentation moment. So again, let's look at an example here with Takadimi. We're just connecting what students have already put together. We're just connecting that to a classroom vocabulary piece. So now we get to extend our musical skills and keep exploring this new element. But this time we are applying our conscious knowledge to these learning activities. That's the real difference here. And at the end of our learning experience, we're going to have a creative invitation. Again, depending on what your summative assessment is. But we're going to have a creative invitation, so like a conscious improvisation or arrangement or composition. And that, even though it is the summative assessment for our concept plan, it also serves as the launch pad into the next concept plan, because this tells us where students are orally and in their skill development of this new concept. So it tells us if we're ready to move on in our big sequence of learning, or if students would benefit from hanging out with this concept a little bit more and taking some time to really develop these musical skills through activities like all of the things that we were doing in our first phase of learning, in that active musicking phase of learning. But then we can add things like reading notation, writing notation, orally identifying the new sound with our new classroom vocabulary. We can do oral dictation, and then we can expand part work skills like adding a rhythmic or a vocal ostinato, or adding partner songs, or doing rounds, something like that. And then a conscious creative decision like arranging or composition or improvisation. So again, the difference between these activities and the ones that we had in our earlier phase of making music is that now students are applying their conscious musical knowledge of our new target element, whatever that element is. In the Schulwerk, this is the create phase, and in the Kodai concept, this is practice. So let's look at a few examples that we might do in the practice phase, or in the conscious music making phase. So we can orally identify the new sound as takadimi. We can read notation and write notation. We can do some conscious improvisation. We can do some dictation. And then arranging rhythmic building blocks. Along the way, with all of these activities, we are looking at how we collaborate in these games and in these learning activities. So, in something like Tideo, we all have to work together. We all have to collaborate like as one unit in order to make that play party work successfully. And then in things like arranging rhythmic building blocks with a partner, we're going to need to collaborate there. Working on dictation things with a partner, all of this serves as a way to exemplify collaboration. So, to summarize this learning progression, we are going to create activities for students by thinking about what we want students to know and be able to do. And then we're going to create a learning context where we make music actively in our classroom community. And we make the target musical element conscious, and then we apply that knowledge as we continue to build more musical skills. We have just planned our entire year, and we have not talked about lesson plans at all. Here's why. For me, in order to be prepared for the upcoming school year, I don't think that having a full year's worth of lesson plans is necessary because we have all of the foundational stuff right here. We have our values, we have the concepts we're going to teach, we have our pacing guide for when we will teach these concepts, we have the repertoire that we're going to explore, and we have all of the activities and the assessments that we're going to use to learn. Everything is already here. The only thing left to do here is to plug these learning activities from the concept plans into daily lesson plans as needed. So maybe that happens on a month-ish basis. Maybe it happens week to week. It's up to you in your lesson planning process. But when we plan from the big picture to the small picture, and when we think through the progression of learning experiences, lesson plans kind of just write themselves. We know what we need to do next because we know what we did in the previous lesson, right? And we know the contour in general of the learning process. And we are using assessments to learn from students about what they need from us next. Okay, in these videos, we have looked at how to plan the entire year by starting with the big picture and then narrowing in to classroom activities. We have thought through why we're teaching, what we're going to teach, when we will teach it, what materials we will use, and how we are going to teach it. Again, I want to stress that the idea of planning our entire year of music has much less to do with filling out templates and making documents look nice. It has much more to do with this framework of thinking. That way, as we are planning our year and we find a new activity, we know where it can fit into our curriculum. And as we are sitting there on Sunday night wondering what we are going to teach Monday morning, all we have to do is look at the last thing that we taught and think about what the next step is. Again, when we have this framework of thinking, it makes all of our other decisions a lot easier to manage. If you enjoyed these videos, be sure to let me know. And if there's another way that I can be helpful to you in this process, let me know that as well. If you have a question or a comment, you can drop it below. You can find me on Instagram. I am at Victoria Bowler, or you can shoot me an email, victoria@victoriabowler.com. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a fabulous start to your year.